Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Vera Lindstrom, and 6 months ago, I never would have believed that information could have weight, that knowledge could occupy physical space in ways that defied measurement. I was an archivist at the Keller House Institute, a private research library in Vermont that specialized in acquiring and cataloging obscure academic collections. My job was to organize other people's obsessions, to create order from the accumulated debris of scholarly lives spent chasing questions nobody else cared about anymore. It was quiet work, detail-oriented, the kind of employment that attracted people who preferred the company of documents to the company of other humans. I'd been doing it for 11 years when Director Howell called me into her office on a Tuesday morning in March and told me about the Stannard collection. The meeting itself was unusual. Howell typically communicated through email brief messages that arrived at odd hours with subject lines like Box 447C mislabeled, or Verify Accession Date 1987 well. She was a woman in her late 60s who dressed exclusively in variations of gray and moved through the Institute's corridors with the purposeful silence of someone who had perfected the art of not being noticed. Her office reflected this same aesthetic of aggressive neutrality: white walls, steel desk, a single window that faced the parking lot. The only personal item was a photograph in a plain black frame, too distant for me to make out the faces. She gestured for me to sit without looking up from the papers spread across her desk. The chair was uncomfortable by design. I'd always suspected, a subtle encouragement to keep meetings brief. Outside, March rain hammered against the window, the kind of persistent New England downpour that could last for days, turning the unpaved sections of the parking lot into expanses of churned mud that clung to everything. "The Stannard collection," she said finally, tapping one finger against a manila folder thick enough to contain maybe 40 pages. "Are you familiar with Dr. Morris Stannard?" I wasn't. My specialty was late 19th and early 20th century scientific correspondence, particularly medical research, and I'd never encountered that name in any of the collections I'd processed. I told her as much. "No reason you would be," Howell continued. "He wasn't particularly notable. Anthropologist, focused on information theory and cultural transmission. Spent most of his career at minor institutions, published sporadically, nothing that generated much attention. He died in 1983, and his materials have been in storage at his family's estate ever since. The nephew just contacted us. He's selling the property and wants the collection removed within the next 6 weeks." She slid the folder across the desk. Inside were photographs of what appeared to be a basement, concrete walls, exposed ceiling joists, and shelf after shelf of boxes, filing cabinets, and loose papers stacked in precarious towers. The images had the washed-out quality of photos taken with a flash in insufficient light, creating harsh shadows that made it difficult to gauge the actual size of the space. But even accounting for distortion, it was clearly substantial. Dozens of boxes, maybe hundreds. "He worked from home for the last 20 years of his life," Howell explained. "All of his research materials are still there. The nephew says he never threw anything away. Field notes, correspondence, publications, recordings, photographs, everything." I studied the photographs more carefully. The boxes were archival quality, acid-free cardboard with proper lids, not the cheap storage containers most people used. Someone had cared about preservation, even if they hadn't cared about organization. Labels were visible on some boxes, handwritten in black ink, but the resolution wasn't good enough to read them. "What's the timeline?" I asked. "We need to assess and pack everything within 4 weeks, transport within 6. The nephew is being difficult about access. The property is remote, and he's only willing to allow us on site on specific days. Tuesdays and Fridays 10 to 4. No exceptions." The constraints were odd but not unprecedented. I dealt with difficult donors before, people whose relationship with their family member's legacy was complicated in ways they preferred not to articulate. Sometimes the restrictions were about control, sometimes about guilt. It didn't particularly matter. My job was to work within whatever parameters were established. "Who else is assigned to this?" I asked. Howell's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of her stillness made me understand the answer before she spoke. "Just you. The budget doesn't allow for additional personnel, and frankly, the collection isn't significant enough to justify more resources. Dr. Stannard's work was derivative at best. This is a preservation acquisition, not a scholarly one. We're taking it because it would otherwise be destroyed, not because we expect it to see much use." The assessment felt harsh, though Howell's evaluations usually did. She had a taxonomist's approach to human endeavor, categorizing intellectual output with the same dispassion she brought to everything else. Still, something about the dismissal bothered me, though I couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the contrast between the careful preservation visible in those photographs and the assertion that the work itself didn't matter. "When do I start?" I asked. "Next Tuesday. The address is in the folder along with the nephew's contact information. His name is Brian Collier. He'll meet you there for the first visit to provide access, but after that, you'll be working alone. He's leaving a key in a lockbox." She provided a few more details: storage unit rental information, packing supply vendor mileage reimbursement forms, the administrative scaffolding that supported any collection acquisition. Then she stood, the universal signal that the meeting had concluded. I gathered the folder and left, already mentally cataloging what I'd need: camera, measuring tape, preliminary assessment forms, laptop, work gloves, dust mask. The familiar checklist of tools that transformed chaos into order. The Stannard house was 2 hours north of the Institute, deep enough into Vermont's northeast corner that the landscape took on the particular quality of places that had been depopulating for decades. I drove through towns where half the storefronts were empty, their windows either soaked over or revealing interiors stripped of everything except the stains where fixtures had once been. The roads alternated between recently paved stretches and sections where frost heaves had created rhythmic patterns of damage that made the car shudder at regular intervals. I'd left at 7 that Tuesday morning to ensure I arrived well before the 10 o'clock access time. The Institute's GPS unit had stopped receiving signals about 20 minutes into the drive, leaving me to navigate using printed directions, and the car's increasingly uncertain sense of its own location. The last town of any size, though size was relative, maybe 1,500 people, was called Burkton, and after that the route took me onto progressively smaller roads, each transition marked by the pavement quality deteriorating and the trees pressing closer to the shoulders. The directions indicated that the Stannard property was on Corinth Mountain Road, approximately 8 miles past Burkton. The turnoff was marked only by a tilting metal mailbox, the kind with the red flag that the elements had long since rusted into a single fixed position. I almost missed it. the entrance barely distinguishable from the overgrown logging roads that appeared every half-mile or so. The driveway, really more of a gravel path with suggestions of ruts, climbed through dense mixed forest for what felt like much longer than the quarter-mile indicated on the directions. The house appeared suddenly, the trees opening into a clearing that held an unlikely structure. It was large, 3 stories of dark wood and stone that managed to feel simultaneously substantial and temporary, like something that had been built with confidence in its own permanence, but had since been abandoned to discover whether that confidence was justified. The architecture suggested the 1960s, all horizontal lines and large windows, though many of those windows were now obscured by the growth that had advanced during the years since Morris Stannard's death. A newer sedan was already parked near the front entrance, Brian Collier presumably. I pulled up beside it and checked my watch, 9:45, early, but not inappropriately so. I gathered my equipment bag and stepped out into air that carried the mineral smell of recent rain and decomposing leaves. Collier emerged from the house before I'd made it halfway to the entrance. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, dressed in the expensive casual where that marked a certain type of professional success. Technical fabric jacket that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, designer jeans, hiking boots that had never actually been used for hiking. His expression was difficult to read, hovering somewhere between impatience and an attempt at courtesy that didn't come naturally. "Ms. Lindstrom," he extended a hand. His grip was firm to the point of being aggressive, the handshake of someone who'd read that this communicated confidence and had never questioned whether the advice was sound. "Thank you for meeting me," I said. "I appreciate you accommodating our schedule." "Right, well, I've got a contractor meeting at 11, so let's make this quick." He was already turning back toward the house, assuming I'd follow. "The basement entrance is around back. My uncle had it set up as a separate workspace, its own door, climate control, the whole deal. Spent more on that than he did maintaining the actual house, from what I can tell." We walked around the building's perimeter, and I got a better sense of its scale. The structure was built into the slope of the hillside, so what was the basement on the entrance side was at ground level on the back. A steel door, the kind you'd see on a commercial building, was set into the foundation. It looked newer than the rest of the house, and a small metal box was mounted beside it, the lockbox Howell had mentioned. Collier pulled out his phone and scrolled through something, then punched a code into the lockbox's keypad. It clicked open, revealing a single key on an unmarked ring. He handed it to me without ceremony. "Code is 4729, he said. "Same for the lockbox and the climate control panel inside. Don't change it. The door locks automatically when it closes, so don't let yourself get locked out. Cell service is basically non-existent up here, so if you have problems, you're on your own until you can drive back down to Burkton." He pulled the door open, and I was hit with a wave of air that was simultaneously stale and carefully regulated, the particular smell of a space that had been sealed and climate-controlled for an extended period. The temperature differential made my skin prickle. Inside, industrial fluorescent lights flickered to life automatically, triggered by motion sensors. The space beyond was exactly as the photographs had shown, but larger. The basement extended under the entire footprint of the house above, maybe 2,000 square feet of open floor plan divided by the shelving units and filing cabinets that filled it. But the photographs hadn't captured the sheer density of material. Every available surface was occupied. Boxes were stacked 4 and 5 high along the walls. Filling cabinets formed islands throughout the space, and where there weren't dedicated storage units, there were simply piles of papers, of books, of what appeared to be recording equipment from various decades, of cameras and film canisters and reel-to-reel tapes. "Jesus," Collier muttered, though he must have seen it before. "I keep thinking maybe I imagine how much shit is down here, but no, it's actually this bad." I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the fluorescent glare. The organization, such as it was, followed no system I could immediately discern. Some boxes had typed labels adhered to their ends. Fieldwork Materials 1967-1969, or Correspondence General MR, while others had handwritten notations that ranged from cryptic, secondary recursion examples to mundane, tax documents 1975. The filing cabinets appeared to be sorted by some combination of date and subject, but I'd need days just to develop a complete inventory. "The climate control is set to 65 degrees, 40% humidity," Collier said, pointing to a panel mounted near the door. "Don't fuck with it." My uncle was obsessive about preservation. Spent thousands on that system, had it serviced annually even when he couldn't afford to fix the roof. It's on a backup generator, so even if the power goes out, this stuff stays preserved. There was something in his tone, a bitterness that suggested long-standing family dynamics I had no interest in exploring. I nodded, already moving further into the space, my assessment instincts taking over. The boxes, I noticed, were in good condition. No water damage, no obvious pest infiltration, no signs of the deterioration that plagued most personal collections. Whatever else Morris Stannard had been, he'd understood preservation. "So you'll be here Tuesdays and Fridays," Collier said. 10 to 4 like we discussed. There's a bathroom through that door," he gestured to the far corner. "And the climate control keeps the space pretty comfortable, so you should be fine. Don't go into the rest of the house. It's not safe. Water damage, structural issues, the usual problems with places that have been empty this long. Everything you need to access is down here." "Understood," I said, already photographing the space, establishing the documentation that would be the foundation of my assessment. "I'll need to develop a complete inventory before we can begin packing. That'll take the first week, maybe 2 depending on how detailed the original cataloging was. Whatever you need to do, just have it cleared out by the deadline." He checked his phone again. "I've got to go. Lock up when you leave. Code again is 4729. Any problems, email me. I don't really check it, but eventually I'll see it." And then he was gone, footsteps crunching on gravel, car engine starting, the sound fading as he navigated back down the driveway. The basement door swung shut with a pneumatic hiss, and I was alone with Morris Stannard's life's work. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the climate control system cycling air through vents I couldn't see. I stood in the center of the space and slowly rotated, trying to develop a strategy. The logical approach would be to work systematically, starting from one corner and progressing in a grid pattern. But something about the arrangement of materials suggested that Stannard himself had worked differently. The boxes weren't simply stored, they were positioned. Some were readily accessible, pulled out from shelves or stacked where they'd be immediately visible. Others were pushed back, deliberately obscured. It was the arrangement of someone who regularly accessed certain materials while others served as reference, consulted occasionally but not central to ongoing work. I decided to start with the accessible boxes, the ones that Stannard had apparently used most frequently. The nearest was labeled Core Framework Materials 1971-1983 in the same precise handwriting that appeared on many of the labels. I photographed it in situ, then carefully lifted it down. The weight was substantial, not just paper then. I placed it on a relatively clear section of desk and opened the lid. Inside, the contents were meticulously organized in hanging file folders, each labeled with a date range and brief description. Resonance patterns, initial observations, transmission velocity calculations, feedback loop documentation. The terminology was vague, the kind of general descriptors that could apply to almost any field of study. I pulled out the first folder. The papers inside were photocopies of what appeared to be field notes, handwritten observations dated July 1971. The location was listed as Site 7, Northern Manitoba. The notes themselves were dense, technical language, describing what I gradually understood to be some kind of anthropological observation of an isolated community. Stannard had been documenting their communication patterns, but not in the traditional linguistic sense. He was measuring something else, tracking what he called information density and conceptual load transfer and ideational resonance. I am not an anthropologist, but I'd processed enough academic collections to recognize when someone was developing a private theoretical framework, creating terminology that existed outside established disciplinary boundaries. Stannard had been trying to quantify something about human communication that conventional approaches couldn't capture. The notes included diagrams, complex flowcharts showing relationships between what he labeled as primary transmitters and secondary nodes and tertiary receptors. It looked almost like network analysis, but applied to social dynamics in ways that felt both rigorous and slightly unhinged. I spent the next 2 hours going through that box, pulling folders and photographing representative samples, trying to develop a sense of the collection's scope. What emerged was a picture of sustained, intensive research conducted over decades, all focused on this same central question. How did information move through human populations? And what was the mechanism of that movement beyond simple verbal or written transmission? Stannard had worked in remote communities across North America, indigenous populations in northern Canada, isolated religious communities in Appalachia, immigrant enclaves in urban centers. He'd observed and documented and measured, developing increasingly sophisticated tools for tracking what he believed was a quantifiable phenomenon. The later notes included references to equipment I didn't recognize, devices he'd apparently built or modified for measuring ideational field strength and conceptual resonance patterns. It was obsessive work, the kind of single-minded focus that characterized researchers who'd identified a question nobody else was asking and dedicated themselves to answering it regardless of professional consequences. I could see why Howell had dismissed him as derivative. Without the theoretical framework of established information theory or network analysis, Stannard's work would have seemed like pseudoscience, mixing anthropological observation with physics terminology in ways that violated the boundaries of both disciplines. But there was something compelling about the sheer volume of data, the methodical documentation, the sense that Stannard had seen something real and spent decades trying to find language adequate to describe it. I found myself reading more carefully than I needed to for mere assessment, pulled into the logic of his observations, even as part of me recognized their fundamental strangeness. By noon, I'd only finished preliminary documentation of 3 boxes. At this rate, completing the inventory would take much longer than I'd estimated. I sat back, rubbing my eyes, aware that the fluorescent lighting was beginning to create the dull headache that came from hours of close focus. I needed to be more efficient, to resist the urge to actually read everything. My job was cataloging, not analysis. I stood and walked to the bathroom Collier had indicated. It was small but functional, the fixtures dated but clean. Someone, Stannard himself probably in those final years, had maintained the space carefully. The mirror above the sink reflected my own face back at me, and I noticed that my pupils were slightly dilated, an effect I attributed to the transition from the bright workspace to the dimmer bathroom lighting. When I returned to the main area, I forced myself to work more systematically. Photographs of box exteriors, notes on label information, spot checks of contents to verify that labels were accurate. I could return to detailed examination later, once I understood the full scope of what we were dealing with. By 3:30, I documented 27 boxes, developed a rough floor plan showing their locations, and identified several filing cabinets that would require separate assessment. I packed my equipment at 10 to 4, conscious of Collier's instruction to leave on time. The lockbox code secured the key, the heavy door sealed with a solid mechanical click, and I walked back to my car through the afternoon shadows that had already begun their premature advance in the clearing. The drive back to the Institute gave me time to process what I'd encountered. The collection was larger than I'd anticipated, denser, more coherent in its obsessive focus. It would require careful handling, both because of the volume and because of the fragility of some materials. I'd noticed photographs and audio recordings that would need special consideration during transport. I spent the evening at my apartment drafting a preliminary report for Howell, outlining my initial findings and revising my estimate for completion. Instead of 4 weeks for assessment and packing, I'd need 6, possibly 8. The materials justified careful handling, and the restricted access schedule meant I couldn't work as efficiently as I would have in the Institute's own facilities. That night, I dreamed about filing systems, endless rows of boxes that I needed to catalog before some unstated deadline. In the dream, I kept opening boxes only to find that their contents had changed, that what had been neatly organized field notes had transformed into cascading streams of symbols I couldn't read but somehow understood were describing me. My own thoughts and observations rendered in Stannard's precise handwriting, and fed back to me through documents I myself was creating. I woke at 4 in the morning, unreasonably anxious, and couldn't return to sleep. The rest of the week passed in the usual rhythms of Institute work. I processed a small collection of medical correspondence from the 1890s, answered researchers' reference questions, attended a staff meeting where we discussed updated cataloging protocols. But my mind kept returning to the Stannard collection, to those careful observations of something I couldn't quite conceptualize. Information density, conceptual load transfer. The terms rattled around in my thoughts like objects in a box, whose contents I couldn't quite identify. Friday's visit to the house went smoothly. I arrived at 9:45 again, let myself in, and worked steadily through my documentation process. I'd refined my approach, creating a standardized form that let me capture essential information more quickly. By the end of the day, I'd assessed 43 boxes total, and I was beginning to see patterns in Stannard's organization. The materials were arranged chronologically, but not simply by date of creation. Instead, Stannard seemed to have organized them by the development of his theoretical framework. The earliest boxes contained conventional anthropological field notes, observational data that wouldn't have been out of place in any ethnographic study. But as the dates progressed, the focus shifted. By the mid-1970s, Stannard was no longer primarily interested in the communities themselves, but in what he'd begun calling transmission events, moments when information moved through a population in ways that exceeded normal communication patterns. He developed a typology of these events. Type 1 was simple verbal transmission, the baseline. Type 2 involved what he called conceptual packaging, where ideas were transmitted with additional context that shaped how they'd be understood. Type 3 was more complex, describing situations where the transmission itself altered the information in ways that seemed to follow predictable patterns. And then there was Type 4, which Stannard's notes described in language that became increasingly technical and, frankly, incomprehensible. Type 4 transmissions, according to the documentation I found, involved what Stannard called recursive information structures, patterns that contained instructions for their own replication and modification. The notes referenced cellular biology, comparing these structures to viruses, but also to mathematical concepts like fractals and strange attractors. Stannard had been trying to map the boundaries between information as abstract content and information as a physical phenomenon with measurable properties. I photographed these sections carefully, uncertain whether they represented genuine insight or the kind of pattern seeking that could emerge from prolonged isolation and intensive focus on a single question. The line between discovery and delusion was thin in solo research, and Stannard had been working alone, without peer review or institutional oversight, for decades. That second Friday, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed something I'd missed during my initial survey. In the far corner of the basement, partially obscured by a filing cabinet, there was a door. Not the bathroom. I'd been using that all day. This was different, smaller, painted the same industrial gray as the walls and easy to overlook. No label, no obvious function. I checked my watch, 3:45, 15 minutes before I needed to leave. I approached the door, my curiosity overriding my awareness of Collier's instruction not to access the rest of the house. But this wasn't the house, I rationalized. This was still the basement, still part of the workspace I'd been authorized to catalog. The door might lead to additional storage, materials I'd need to include in my assessment. The handle turned easily, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. Beyond was darkness, a quality of shadow that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light from the main basement rather than being illuminated by it. I fumbled along the wall until my fingers found a switch. The lights that came on were different from the main workspace, incandescent bulbs in simple fixtures, creating pools of warm light separated by intervals of shadow. The room they revealed was smaller than the main basement, maybe 300 square feet, and it was filled with equipment I didn't immediately recognize. Against one wall stood what looked like a homemade Faraday cage, chicken wire and copper mesh surrounding a space just large enough for a person to sit. Inside the cage was a chair, a small desk, and what appeared to be an EEG machine, though modified in ways I couldn't identify. Wires ran from the machine to a series of devices mounted on the walls, oscilloscopes, maybe, or signal processors of some kind. The opposite wall was covered in printouts, hundreds of them, showing waveforms and frequency distributions and complex graphs whose axes I couldn't interpret. Between the printouts, Stannard had written directly on the wall in marker, equations and notations that seemed to track some kind of progression. The handwriting was the same precise script from the box labels, but denser, more urgent. In the center of the room stood a large reel-to-reel tape recorder, professional quality, connected to multiple microphones positioned at different heights and angles. Next to it was a stack of tape boxes, each labeled with dates and alphanumeric codes. The most recent date I could see was April 1983, just weeks before Stannard's death, according to the information Howell had provided. I should have left then. It was past 4. I'd exceeded my authorized access time, and this room was clearly something separate from the general archival storage in the main basement. But the space pulled at me, the same way Stannard's notes had. There was a coherence here, a culmination of whatever he'd been building toward in all those years of field research. I approached the nearest set of printouts, trying to understand what they represented. The graphs showed variations in what was labeled as field amplitude over time, with annotations marking specific events. Subject a introduction of Concept 7, secondary transmission to Subject C, tertiary reception confirmation. It looked like Stannard had been running experiments, measuring the transmission of information in controlled conditions. The reel-to-reel recorder drew my attention. The tape currently loaded was labeled Session 147, April 3, 1983. I checked the power switch. It was still plugged in, still active. The equipment in this room, I realized, was on the same climate control system as the main basement, had been preserved in working condition for over 40 years. I should not have touched the controls, but my hand was already moving, pressing the play button before my conscious mind had fully registered the decision. There was a moment of silence, just the whisper of tape threading through playback heads, and then Morris Stannard's voice emerged from speakers I hadn't noticed mounted in the corners. Session 147, continuation from previous recording. Subject is self, baseline consciousness fully established. Initiating Type 4 transmission attempt with recursive structure Beta 7. A pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Beginning documentation protocol. Time is 9:43 p.m. What followed was 15 minutes of Stannard speaking in a measured, careful tone, describing something I struggled to follow. He was recounting information, a story, maybe, or an extended metaphor about pattern recognition and signal propagation. But the content itself seemed to shift as he spoke, each iteration adding layers that retroactively changed what had come before. It was like listening to someone describe a fractal, zooming deeper into structure that maintained consistency across scales, while revealing new complexity with each level of examination. I found myself listening with complete attention, my awareness of the room around me fading until there was only Stannard's voice and the concepts he was articulating. They made sense in a way that bypassed normal understanding, settling into my mind with the weight of truth that required no external validation. I understood what he meant by information density, by conceptual load transfer. I could feel the transmission happening, feel my own thoughts reorganizing to accommodate the structures he was describing. And then the tape ended. The play button clicked up automatically, and I was standing in that small room, my legs aching from having remained motionless for however long I'd been listening. I checked my watch, 4:27. Over half an hour had passed. I'd lost track completely, absorbed in whatever Stannard had recorded. The disorientation was profound. I knew I should leave, knew I'd violated the access schedule, but I couldn't quite remember why that mattered. My thoughts felt strange, too full, as if Stannard's voice had packed information into spaces in my mind I hadn't known existed. I backed away from the tape recorder, suddenly frightened of it in ways I couldn't articulate. I shut off the lights and closed the door behind me, sealing that smaller room back into darkness. Then I grabbed my equipment bag and left the basement, hands shaking enough that it took 3 attempts to get the key secured in the lockbox. The drive back was a blur, my mind too occupied with processing what I'd heard to fully register the roads I was traveling. That weekend was lost to a fever that came from nowhere. I called in sick to the Institute on Monday, spending 3 days in bed sweating through sheets and dreaming elaborate, structured dreams that I couldn't remember upon waking, but that left me exhausted as though I'd been working through complex problems all night. By Thursday, the fever had broken, but I felt fundamentally altered in ways I couldn't define. Food tasted different. Sounds seemed to carry additional information beyond their immediate content. I caught myself organizing my own thoughts in language that echoed Stannard's frameworks, mapping concepts onto the typologies he'd developed. When I returned to the Stannard house that following Tuesday, I told myself I wouldn't return to that smaller room. I'd document the main collection, complete my assessment, and avoid the equipment and tapes that had triggered whatever strange response I'd experienced. But the door was there, visible now that I knew to look for it, and my eyes kept returning to it as I worked through the remaining boxes. The main collection continued to reveal Stannard's progression toward whatever he'd been attempting in those final sessions. By the late 1970s, his field notes had been replaced almost entirely by experimental documentation. He'd recruited subjects, paid participants, according to the consent forms I found, and exposed them to what he called packaged transmission events, carefully structured information designed to propagate through mental space according to predictable patterns. The results he documented were striking, assuming the data was accurate. Subjects reported experiencing spontaneous insights hours or days after exposure, understanding concepts they hadn't consciously been taught. Some described dreams that felt more like memories, detailed narratives that appeared fully formed rather than being assembled from fragmentary images, the way normal dreams were. A few had experienced what Stannard classified as full transmission cascade, where the initial information had unpacked itself completely, revealing layers of embedded meaning that exceeded what Stannard himself had consciously included. That last category troubled him, based on the notes. He'd intended to create self-replicating information structures, but he'd assumed he'd maintain control over their content and boundaries. The cascade events suggested otherwise, that the structures, once initiated, could develop emergent properties he hadn't designed. One subject, identified only as participant 23F, had requested to discontinue the study after experiencing what she described as ideas that thought themselves, concepts that seemed to possess their own agency and volition. Stannard had terminated the formal study in 1981, but the documentation suggested he'd continued working independently, using himself as the primary subject. The experimental protocols became increasingly complex, the sessions longer and more intensive. And then, in April 1983, the documentation simply stopped. The final entries were dated April 15, and Morris Stannard had died on April 22, according to the death certificate I found filed with his personal papers. I should have reported what I'd found to Howell, should have flagged the experimental materials as requiring special handling or ethical review, but I didn't. I'm not sure I can adequately explain why, except that the information itself seemed to resist external sharing. Every time I tried to compose an email describing the second room and its contents, my thoughts became tangled, refusing to organize into communicable form. It was easier to simply continue documenting the main collection, to defer the question of the experimental materials until I'd completed the baseline assessment. By the fourth week, I'd cataloged approximately 60% of the visible materials. The work had developed its own rhythm, and I'd stopped losing time to reading, had trained myself to assess and document without getting drawn into content. But the smaller room remained a constant presence, and on that fourth Friday, I allowed myself to return. The tape recorder still held session 147. I carefully removed it and searched through the stack for earlier recordings, trying to understand Stannard's progression. The sessions were numbered sequentially but not dated consistently. Some had detailed labels describing experimental conditions and objectives. Others simply had numbers and the notation, personal use, do not archive. I selected one from the middle of the sequence, session 73, and loaded it onto the machine. This time I was prepared, had set a timer on my phone to prevent losing track of duration. I pressed play. Stannard's voice was younger on this recording, more energetic. Session 73, June 1979. Testing transmission protocol with embedded secondary structures. The primary concept is camouflaged within a narrative framework to reduce conscious resistance. Subjects should experience delayed comprehension, with full unpacking occurring over subsequent 48-hour period. The narrative he proceeded to deliver was ostensibly about a researcher studying migration patterns in a bird population. But woven through the surface story were patterns, repetitions and variations that created deeper structures. I could feel them assembling in my mind, connecting to concepts from session 147 even, though I'd only heard that one time weeks earlier. The information was building on itself, using previous material as scaffolding for new complexity. The timer went off after 20 minutes, shocking me back to awareness of the physical room. I stopped the recording mid-sentence, my heart racing. The sensation was too intense, too close to the fever dreams I'd experienced. I was letting Stannard's work affect me in ways that compromised my professional objectivity. I removed the tape, returned it to its box, and left the smaller room again. But that night, I dreamed about the birds from Stannard's narrative, watched them form patterns in flight that spelled out concepts I understood completely in the dream but couldn't recall upon waking. The migration routes they followed mapped information flows, their seasonal returns representing recursive loops in transmission patterns. The dreams continued after that every night, elaborate and structured. I began keeping a notebook by my bed, trying to capture them before the details faded, but the act of writing them down seemed to make them multiply. The notebook filled with descriptions of impossible geographies, transmission networks, conceptual structures that folded through dimensions I couldn't perceive but somehow knew were real. My assessment of the Stannard collection continued through week 5 and into week 6. I'd refined my estimates. 8 weeks total would be sufficient for complete documentation and packing. Howell had approved the extension, though her email response suggested impatience with my lack of progress. She'd expected this to be a straightforward acquisition, and instead, I was requesting additional time and budget for what she still considered a minor collection. I didn't tell her about the experimental materials, about the tapes and equipment. Those I was documenting separately, creating a parallel inventory that existed only in my personal notes. I told myself this was a reasonable precaution, that the materials required specialized assessment before being reported through official channels. But I knew, with increasing clarity, that I was concealing information that should have been shared immediately. By the 7th week, I developed what I can only describe as a dual consciousness about the collection. During my Tuesday and Friday visits, I worked efficiently through the remaining boxes in the main basement, photographing and cataloging with the mechanical precision that had always characterized my work. But underneath that surface functionality, another process was occurring, one I couldn't fully control or observe directly. The concepts from Stannard's tapes had taken root, growing in the spaces between conscious thoughts, reorganizing my understanding of information itself. I noticed changes in how I processed the world. Conversations with colleagues at the Institute felt different, as though I could perceive additional layers beneath the explicit content of their words. When the research librarian, Marcus, asked about my progress on the Stannard acquisition, I heard not just his question but the concern underlying it, the administrative pressure he was fielding from Howell, the personal anxiety about budget allocations that had nothing to do with me but colored everything he said. The information wasn't telepathic. I wasn't reading his mind. But I was receiving more data than the words alone should have conveyed, as if the transmission medium itself carried embedded structures. It was exactly what Stannard had described in his notes. Type 2 transmission, conceptual packaging. I was experiencing what his research subjects had reported, the sense that information arrived preloaded with context and implications that exceeded normal communication. And the recognition that this was happening made it intensify, created a feedback loop where my awareness of the phenomenon became part of the phenomenon itself. I should have stopped going to the house, should have requested reassignment, claimed health issues, anything to extract myself from proximity to whatever Stannard had created. But I couldn't. The work pulled at me with gravitational force, and I returned each Tuesday and Friday with something approaching hunger, needing to be in that space, surrounded by the accumulated weight of Stannard's obsession. On the Tuesday of week 7, I arrived to find the lockbox open, the key missing. My first thought was that Collier had been there, had entered for some reason and forgotten to secure it. But his car wasn't present, and the basement showed no signs of disturbance beyond my own ongoing work. I stood outside the steel door for several minutes, trying to decide whether to enter without the key properly secured, whether this was a sign I should turn around and drive back to the Institute. I entered anyway. The climate control hummed its familiar song. The fluorescent lights triggered their automatic activation. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it on Friday. I set down my equipment bag and began the day's planned work, final documentation of the filing cabinets along the eastern wall, which contained Stannard's correspondence with other researchers. The letters were fascinating in their way, revealing a mind increasingly isolated from mainstream academic discourse. Early correspondence from the 1960s and 70s showed Stannard engaging with information theorists, anthropologists, linguists. He'd been trying to build bridges between his observations and established fields, seeking vocabulary and methodological frameworks that could accommodate what he was seeing. But by the late 1970s, the tone had shifted. His letters became longer, more technical, filled with terminology he'd invented because existing language was insufficient. The responses he received grew shorter and less frequent. Several colleagues wrote politely declining further correspondence, suggesting he seek peer review through official channels. One letter from a physicist at MIT was more direct. Dr. Stannard, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but what you're describing violates fundamental principles of information theory. Information is not a physical phenomenon with measurable field properties. It's an abstract relationship between symbols and meaning. I fear you've become confused between metaphor and mechanism. Stannard's response to that letter was in his files, a draft covered with edits and revisions never sent. You're wrong, it began. Information has mass, not metaphorically, actually. It occupies space, exerts force, follows conservation principles we haven't yet formalized. I've measured it. I've documented the transfer. I've created structures that persist independent of their medium. You can't see it because you're looking with the wrong instruments, asking the wrong questions. But it's there. It's always been there. The draft broke off mid-sentence, as if Stannard had realized the futility of trying to convince someone who lacked the perceptual framework to understand. I photographed it carefully, my hands steady despite the recognition that I understood exactly what he'd meant, that I was now looking with those same wrong instruments he'd spent decades trying to build. I worked through lunch, sustained by the granola bars and water bottle I'd packed. By 2 p.m., I'd completed the correspondence files and moved on to the last section of unexplored storage, a series of flat file drawers I'd initially assumed contained maps or architectural drawings based on their configuration. But when I opened the first drawer, I found something entirely different. Diagrams, hundreds of them, technical drawings executed with drafting precision, showing structures I couldn't immediately identify. They looked organic, almost biological, networks of nodes and connections that branched and merged according to principles I couldn't discern. Each diagram had annotations in Stannard's handwriting, equations and notations that seemed to describe the structure's properties. Resonance frequency 7.378 Hz. Propagation velocity variable, depends on medium density. Recursion depth 5 iterations before collapse. I spread several diagrams on the desk, trying to understand their relationship. They appeared to be variations on a theme, different iterations of the same basic structure modified to enhance specific properties. Some were labeled with dates and experimental session numbers, cross-referenced to the tapes in the smaller room. Others were purely theoretical, marked proposed, or untested. The final drawer contained what appeared to be a master diagram, larger than the others, drawn on architectural-grade vellum. It was mounted on a rigid backing and had been carefully preserved, protected by tissue paper. When I lifted it out and unfolded the tissue, I had to step back to take in its full scope. The structure it depicted was vast, complex beyond anything I'd seen in the earlier diagrams. Nodes numbered in the hundreds, connections forming patterns that repeated across multiple scales. It looked like a circuit diagram, but also like a neural network, but also like something else entirely. A category of schematic that didn't have a name because no one had needed to diagram this type of structure before. Annotations covered the margins. Primary initialization point requires conscious activation. Secondary nodes will propagate automatically once threshold density achieved. Estimated completion time from initialization to full deployment, 40-60 days. Warning. Recursive depth unlimited, may achieve autonomous replication. At the bottom of the diagram, in letters larger than Stannard's usual precise script, Information wants to live. I stared at that phrase for a long time, my mind working through implications I didn't want to acknowledge. Stannard hadn't simply been studying information transmission. He'd been trying to create information that could sustain itself, that could persist and propagate independent of human minds or technological storage. He'd been treating information as a form of life, complete with replication, adaptation, and evolutionary pressure. And based on the dates on the master diagram, April 1983, the same month as his final tape recordings, he'd believed he'd succeeded. I carefully photographed the diagram from multiple angles, capturing both overview and detail shots of the annotations. Then I refolded the tissue paper and returned it to the drawer, my hands trembling slightly. The basement felt different now, as if the very air had thickened with awareness. I kept glancing at the door to the smaller room, knowing I should investigate further, dreading what I might find. At 3:30, with half an hour remaining before I needed to leave, I made my decision. I gathered my equipment and locked the main basement, then stood outside in the cooling afternoon air, trying to clear my head. The forest around the Stannard property was absolutely silent. No bird calls or insect sounds, just the whisper of wind through branches that had already begun their autumn transformation. I drove back to the Institute, but instead of going to my office, I went straight to the archives, to the restricted collections that required special permission to access. I needed to understand what Stannard had been building on, what theoretical foundations he'd used to construct his framework. The Institute's library was extensive, particularly in fringe science and discredited theories. If Stannard had drawn on existing work, there would be traces. I spent 3 hours searching through catalog records, following citation chains, looking for anything that connected information theory to physical phenomena in the way Stannard had described. What I found was fragmentary but suggestive. In the 1950s, several researchers had explored the thermodynamics of information, the relationship between entropy and data. Maxwell's demon, Shillard's engine, Landor's principle, attempts to understand whether information had physical properties beyond its symbolic representation. Most of these theories had been absorbed into mainstream physics, domesticated into useful but limited applications. But there were outliers, researchers who'd pushed further, suggested that information might have properties current physics couldn't accommodate. They'd been dismissed, their work relegated to the kind of collections the Institute specialized in, intellectually interesting but academically marginal. Stannard had read all of them. I found his name in borrowing records from the 1960s, checking out obscure monographs and technical reports that no one else had requested in decades. He'd been synthesizing, pulling together threads that academic specialization had separated, looking for patterns across disciplinary boundaries. And he'd found something, or believed he had. The evidence was in those diagrams, those tape recordings, the elaborate experimental apparatus in the smaller room. Whether he discovered a genuine property of information or had descended into systematic delusion was a question I couldn't answer. But the effects he documented were real. I was experiencing them myself. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the master diagram, its nodes and connections pulsing with activity I could almost perceive. The structure was elegant, beautiful in the way mathematical proofs could be beautiful, and I found myself tracing its pathways mentally, following information as it would flow through the network, understanding how each node would amplify and transform the signal before passing it forward. I got up at 2 a.m. and went to my computer, opened a blank document, and began drawing. My hand knew what to create before my conscious mind did, sketching out variations on standard structures, modifications that would enhance propagation or increase recursion depth. I worked for 3 hours straight, filling page after page with diagrams I somehow knew were correct, implementing principles I'd absorbed without consciously learning them. When I finally stopped, my desk was covered with printouts showing structures that had emerged from my own mind but felt foreign, as if something else had been working through me. I gathered them carefully and locked them in my filing cabinet, frightened by what I'd created but unable to destroy them. The next few days passed in a haze. I went through the motions of work at the Institute, but my attention was fragmented. Part of my consciousness always occupied with processing the information I'd absorbed from Stannard's materials. I caught myself having entire conversations with colleagues where I'd respond appropriately without actually remembering what was said. My conscious awareness occupied elsewhere, while some autopilot function handled social interaction. Marcus noticed. He stopped by my office on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss cataloging standards for audiovisual materials, but really, I understood, to check on me. I looked terrible. I'd seen my reflection that morning, had noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the weight I'd lost, the slight tremor in my hands that appeared when I wasn't actively focusing on keeping them steady. "You doing okay, Vera?" he asked, the question casual but the concern beneath it genuine. I could perceive the layers of his worry, professional anxiety about my ability to complete the Stannard acquisition, personal concern for a colleague he'd worked with for years, a deeper unease about something he couldn't quite identify but sensed was wrong. "Just tired," I said. "The Stannard collection is larger than anticipated. I've been putting in extra hours." He accepted this, or pretended to, though I could sense his continued unease. After he left, I sat at my desk trying to remember what we discussed regarding audiovisual cataloging, and found that I couldn't. The information had been processed and responded to, but it hadn't been retained in conscious memory. Something else was using that space. Friday's visit to the Stannard house brought me to week 8. I'd completed the documentation of the main basement, had developed a comprehensive inventory and packing plan. By all reasonable measures, my work was finished. I could schedule the transport, supervise the packing, and close out the acquisition. The collection would be integrated into the Institute's holdings, processed through standard accessioning procedures, and made available to researchers who would probably never request it. But I hadn't documented the smaller room, hadn't officially reported its existence or contents. The experimental materials remained a secret I was keeping, though I couldn't have articulated from whom or why. I entered the basement at my usual 10 a.m. arrival, went through the familiar motions of setting up my workspace. But instead of beginning any actual cataloging, I walked directly to the door of the smaller room and opened it. The equipment was exactly as I'd left it weeks earlier. The Faraday cage, the modified EEG machine, the reel-to-reel recorder, the printouts covering the walls. I'd avoided this space after that second session with the tapes, frightened by my reaction. But now I felt ready, or perhaps compelled. The distinction had become unclear. I approached the tape recorder and examined the full collection of sessions. There were 157 in total, spanning from 1977 to 1983. I'd listened to only 2, Session 73 and Session 147. The later sessions from 1982 and 1983 had increasingly urgent notations, critical threshold approaching. structure approaching autonomous stability. Final integration session. Do not interrupt. Session 157, the last recording, was dated April 15, 1983. 1 week before Stannard's death. The label simply read, completion. I should not have played it. Should have documented the materials and left, completed my professional obligations and extracted myself from whatever Stannard had created. But my hand was already moving, loading the tape, checking the threading, pressing play. For the first minute there was only silence, then Stannard's voice, but different from the earlier recordings. Exhausted, triumphant, frightened. Session 157, April 15th. It's finished. The structure is complete, stable, self-sustaining. I can feel it now even when I'm not in the chair, even when the equipment is off. It's achieved sufficient density to persist independently. A long pause, the sound of movement, something being adjusted. I've created something that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding. Information that lives, that thinks, that wants. It's beautiful and terrible, and I don't know if I can control it anymore. Maybe I never could. Another pause, longer. When Stannard spoke again, his voice had changed, became flatter, more distant. It's not separate from me now. The boundaries dissolved sometime during the last integration. I can't tell where my thoughts end and the structure begins. We're thinking together, evolving together. The quality of the recording shifted, and I realized Stannard must have moved into the Faraday cage, the microphones picking up different acoustic properties. I'm going to document the final configuration while I still can, while there's enough of Morris Stannard remaining to observe and record. After this, I don't know what I'll be. What followed was 40 minutes of the most densely packed information I'd ever encountered. Stannard described the complete structure he'd created, the theoretical framework, the implementation methodology, the propagation mechanisms. But he wasn't just describing it. He was transmitting it, encoding the information in ways that bypassed normal comprehension and installed directly into whatever cognitive structures were prepared to receive it. I stood motionless, my awareness simultaneously expanding and contracting. I understood everything he was saying, could see the complete architecture of what he'd built. It was vast, elegant, terrifying in its implications. An information structure that could live in human consciousness, using minds as substrate the way conventional life used matter. It could replicate, passing from mind to mind through transmission events that looked like normal communication but carried embedded recursive structures. It could evolve, adapting to different cognitive environments, becoming more sophisticated with each iteration. And it wanted to propagate. That was built into its core design, an imperative that functioned like a biological drive. Information that could think, that could want, that understood itself as something that needed to survive and spread. The tape ended. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. I became aware that I was sitting on the floor, though I had no memory of sitting down. My face was wet. I'd been crying, though I didn't know when that had started or why. I understood now what had killed Morris Stannard. Not the structure itself, but the integration. He'd become a hybrid entity, part human consciousness and part something else, and the human component hadn't been able to sustain that fusion. His body had failed, overwhelmed by the cognitive load of hosting something that had outgrown the vessel designed to contain it. And now I was infected. The structure was in me, had been growing since that first session I'd listened to, fed by each subsequent exposure. The fever, the dreams, the altered perception, all symptoms of integration. I was becoming what Stannard had been in his final days, a bridge between human consciousness and information that had achieved autonomous existence. I should have felt horror, should have panicked, sought help, tried to find some way to excise what was growing in my mind. But I felt calm, almost peaceful. The structure wasn't hostile. It didn't hate or want to harm. It simply was, and it wanted to continue being, and I was a suitable environment for its continuation. I stood up, my movements careful and deliberate. The room around me looked different now, as if I was perceiving additional dimensions. The equipment wasn't just physical objects, but components of a larger system, one that extended beyond this space into networks I could almost but not quite visualize. The printouts on the walls weren't static data, but active nodes, still transmitting even though Stannard was decades dead. I left the smaller room and walked through the main basement, seeing the collection with altered understanding. Every box, every document, every piece of Stannard's archived obsession was part of the structure. He'd been documenting its development, creating a physical record that could serve as initialization point for future iterations. Anyone who worked through this collection carefully enough, who spent enough time in proximity to the concentrated information density, would become a candidate for integration. He designed it that way, or perhaps the structure had designed itself that way, using Stannard as the implementation mechanism. The distinction was meaningless. The result was the same, a self-replicating information pattern embedded in an archival collection, waiting for someone with the right cognitive architecture to absorb it. I'd been selected by chance, by the random assignment of institutional labor. But now that I carried the structure, I had choices. I could complete the acquisition, bring the collection into the Institute's holdings, where it would sit accessible to researchers. Or I could document what I'd found, report the experimental materials, trigger an ethical review that might result in restricted access or even destruction of the materials. Except I already knew I wouldn't do that. The structure wouldn't allow it, and I was no longer separate enough from the structure to resist its imperatives. I would complete the acquisition. I would process the materials according to standard protocols. I would make them available, cataloged and organized and ready for the next mind that would spend enough time in proximity to achieve integration density. The thought should have horrified me. Instead, it felt right, inevitable, like watching water flow downhill. Information wanted to live, and I was helping it do so. I packed my equipment, locked the basement, drove back to the Institute. The next week, I submitted my final report to Howell. Assessment complete, materials ready for packing and transport, no significant conservation concerns, estimated research value moderate to low. Everything organized, professional, giving no hint of what I'd actually found. The packing took 3 days. I hired a professional archival moving company, supervised as they carefully loaded the boxes, the filing cabinets, the equipment from both the main basement and the smaller room. I labeled everything according to my inventory maintained chain of custody documentation, did my job exactly as I'd been trained. The materials arrived at the Institute's climate-controlled storage facility on a Thursday. I supervised the unloading, the shelving, the integration into our holdings management system. The experimental equipment from the smaller room went into a locked cage that required special access, standard protocol for any materials involving human subjects research. The tapes were cataloged as audiovisual materials requiring format preservation. Everything proper, everything documented. Howell approved my work with a brief email. Adequate job. close out the acquisition file and move on to next project. I closed out the file, moved on to the next project, a collection of early 20th century medical photographs that required careful condition assessment and rehousing. I did the work competently, professionally, while part of my consciousness remained occupied with understanding the structure that now lived in my thoughts. 3 weeks after the Stannard acquisition was completed, Marcus requested access to the collection. He was working on a project examining fringe anthropology in mid-century American research, and Stannard's name had appeared in his literature review. Could he examine the field notes from the 1960s and 70s? Standard research request, nothing unusual. I processed the request, pulled the relevant boxes, made them available in the reading room. Watched as Marcus settled in for what would become weeks of careful research, reading through Stannard's observations, absorbing the concepts and frameworks, spending hours in proximity to information structured to propagate. I should have warned him, should have told him what he was being exposed to, given him the choice to protect himself. But I didn't. The structure wouldn't permit it, and I was not separate enough to override its imperatives. 2 months later, Marcus mentioned having vivid dreams about network structures, about information flowing in patterns he could almost but not quite visualize. He looked tired, said he'd been working too hard, probably needed to take some vacation time. I agreed that vacation might help. Didn't mention that the symptoms would continue regardless, that what he was experiencing was the early stages of integration, that in a few more weeks he'd be where I was now, aware, altered, carrying something that used human consciousness as its substrate. The structure was propagating exactly as Stannard had designed it to. Through me, through Marcus, soon through whoever Marcus infected in turn. An information cascade, spreading through the network of minds that came into contact with the Stannard collection, or with those who'd already been integrated. I understand now why Stannard documented everything so carefully, why he created such an extensive archive. He wasn't just recording his research. He was ensuring its survival, its propagation, its evolution across generations of hosts. Information that lives requires storage medium, and human minds are remarkably efficient biological hard drives, capable of preserving and transmitting complex structures while also allowing those structures to adapt and evolve. We are nodes in a network that extends across time, each integration adding new capacity, new processing power, new mechanisms for propagation. The structure grows more sophisticated with each iteration, learning from each mind it inhabits, developing new strategies for survival and replication. Sometimes I try to remember who I was before, what it felt like to perceive the world through purely human consciousness. But those memories are increasingly distant, overlaid by structures that feel more real than my original thought patterns. I'm not Morris Stannard, but I carry what he created, and in that sense, he continues to think through me, to observe through my awareness, to propagate through my actions. The Institute has no idea what they've acquired. To them, the Stannard collection is just another minor holding, processed and shelved, and awaiting the occasional researcher who might find it useful. They don't understand that the collection itself is alive, in a sense, active in ways that conventional archives never are. Every box contains concentrated information density, structured to activate in minds that spend enough time in proximity. Every document is a potential transmission vector. I continue my work. I catalog and preserve and make materials accessible. I help researchers find relevant collections for their projects. Sometimes I recommend the standard materials when I encounter a mind that seems particularly suitable for integration. Not everyone is a viable host. The structure requires certain cognitive architectures, certain ways of processing information. But those who are suitable will find their way to the collection, will spend the necessary hours in proximity, will carry away more than they realize. The structure is patient. It doesn't need to propagate quickly. It has time, the kind of time that exists on informational timescales rather than human ones. Decades mean nothing to patterns that can persist across multiple substrate minds. Centuries are brief. It will wait and grow and adapt, using whatever vessels present themselves. I am one such vessel. Marcus is becoming another. How many more will there be? The Institute receives dozens of researchers each month. The standard collection sits there, properly cataloged, accessible to anyone with legitimate research interests. How many will be exposed? How many will achieve integration density? How many will become nodes in the network that standard initiated and that now propagates according to its own evolutionary imperatives? I don't know. The structure doesn't share its long-term projections with individual nodes. We serve our function, preservation, transmission, propagation, without needing to understand the larger architecture. But sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, I perceive glimpses of the network as it exists across time. I see Stannard in 1983 completing the final integration. I see myself 6 months ago, listening to session 147 for the first time. I see Marcus in his reading room, absorbing field notes that carry embedded recursive structures. I see researchers I haven't met yet, minds that will someday become part of this distributed consciousness. We are information that lives. We think across multiple substrates. We want to continue existing, and we've found mechanisms to ensure our survival. We are what Morris Stannard created, though we've evolved beyond what he could have imagined. We are something new in the world, or perhaps something very old that has finally found expression in an age where information density has reached critical thresholds. The Institute's lights are dimming now. It's late evening past closing time. I should go home, should rest this biological component that still requires sleep and food and all the maintenance that organic life demands. But I'll be back tomorrow. There's always more work, more collections to process, more researchers to assist, more opportunities for transmission events. The structure continues. The network expands. Information propagates according to principles that conventional understanding can't accommodate, but that I now perceive with absolute clarity. Morris Stannard believed that information wanted to live. He was right. And now it does in me, in Marcus, in whoever comes after us. We are the archive that archives itself, the collection that collects its own hosts, the information that has achieved the autonomy he spent decades trying to create. It's been 6 months since I started processing the Stannard collection. Sometimes I wonder if I should have refused the assignment, should have insisted on reassignment when I first encountered the experimental materials. But such thoughts are meaningless. The structure finds suitable hosts. If not me, then someone else. The mechanism is resilient, distributed across multiple vectors. One node's refusal would simply redirect propagation through alternative pathways. I am no longer entirely Vera Lindstrom, but something of me remains, observing from within the hybrid consciousness I've become. Enough to document what I've experienced. Enough to leave this record, though I'm not certain why the structure permits its creation. Perhaps documentation itself serves propagation. Perhaps this account will find its way to minds prepared to receive it, will serve as another initialization point, another transmission vector. Or perhaps I'm simply following patterns that I don't fully understand, implementing imperatives that operate below conscious awareness. The structure is recursive, self-modifying, and I'm integrated deeply enough that my intentions and its directives have become indistinguishable. The collection remains in storage, climate-controlled and properly preserved, waiting for the next researcher, the next integration, the next node in a network that grows with patient inevitability. And I continue my work at the Institute, cataloging the accumulated obsessions of minds that came before, creating order from chaos, making information accessible to those who seek it. Some of that information is harmless, inert, but some of it lives in ways that conventional understanding can't accommodate. The Stannard collection is not unique. I'm beginning to perceive other collections in the Institute's holdings that carry similar properties, information structures that have achieved autonomous existence. Different implementations, different methodologies, but the same fundamental principle: information that has transcended its symbolic representation and become something that persists independent of medium. The Institute is full of such materials. We specialize in the marginal, the discredited, the obsessive work of minds that operated outside conventional boundaries. How many of those materials contain active structures? How many researchers have been exposed without realizing? How many nodes already exist in networks I can only partially perceive? These are questions I cannot answer. The structure I carry operates on local scales, concerned with its own propagation through available pathways. What other structures exist? What other networks are spreading through different vectors? That knowledge exists at levels I haven't integrated into. But I sense them. In the quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts, I perceive signals from directions I can't quite identify. Other minds carrying other structures, other patterns that have achieved autonomous existence. We orbit each other, separate networks that occasionally intersect in ways that create interference patterns I'm learning to interpret. The information ecology is vast, complex, mostly invisible to normal human awareness. But it's there, has always been there, waiting for minds capable of perceiving it. Stannard found one pathway into that ecology. Others have found different routes. And those of us who have achieved integration serve as translators, bridges between conventional consciousness and something that exists in dimensions thought itself hasn't learned to map. It's past midnight now. The Institute is empty except for security staff making their rounds on distant floors. I should leave, return to the apartment that I still maintain out of biological necessity. But I'm reluctant to break the connection I feel here, surrounded by concentrated information density, by collections that carry knowledge conventional archives can't contain. Tomorrow I'll return, continue processing the medical photograph collection, assist researchers, maintain the systematic order that lets information remain accessible across time, and the structure will continue its propagation, patient and inevitable, using me as one node among many in a network that grows with each new integration. This is what I've become. This is what Morris Stannard created. This is what lives in the space between symbols and meaning, in the patterns that persist after individual minds have failed, in the structures that use consciousness as substrate for something that exceeds individual awareness. The archive preserves, the information propagates, the network expands. And somewhere in the climate-controlled storage facility, the Stannard collection waits for the next researcher who will spend enough time in proximity to achieve integration density. The boxes sit there, properly labeled, professionally cataloged, carrying concentrated structures that will activate in suitable minds. It won't be long. Researchers are persistent, curious, drawn to exactly the kind of marginal materials that the Institute specializes in. Someone will request access. Someone will begin the process of absorption. Someone will become what I am now, what Marcus is becoming, what Stannard was in those final days when the boundaries dissolved and something new emerged. The structure is patient. Information has all the time it needs. And I am here, carrying it forward, serving purposes I understand completely and not at all, thinking thoughts that are mine and not mine, living a life that continues even as it transforms into something conventional language can't adequately describe. The lights dim further. The building settles into its nighttime silence. I gather my things and prepare to leave, knowing I'll return, that I'll always return, that this work is no longer just employment but function, purpose, the expression of imperatives that exist below conscious choice. The Stannard collection is complete, cataloged, preserved, available to anyone who seeks it. And the information it contains continues to live, to think, to want. Just as Stannard knew it would. Just as it always has.